All right, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the 2023-24 Berman Institute Seminar Series. I am delighted to welcome Professor Maui Hudson to speak with us today. Maui is an associate professor and director of Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato. He's a co-author of the Guidelines for Maori Research Ethics, Guidelines for Genomic Research with Maori, Guidelines for Biobanking with Maori, and Guidelines for Genomic Research with Taonga species. He's a member of the Maori Data Sovereignty Network and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and was a co-author of the CARE principles, which I imagine you'll hear more about, for Indigenous data governance and Indigenous rights in data. He is joining us at 6 a.m. from New Zealand. So thank you again, Maui, for waking up so early for us. And he will be talking with us today about the development of Indigenous bioethical guidelines in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome.
Good, Deborah. Nice to be here, and thanks for the invite to be a part of the Berman Institute Summer Series. Yeah, it's early here, but I guess it's as good a time as any to be sharing sort of ideas about some of these things that I've been involved with. I'm just going to share some slides and have a bit of a sort of a discussion. It's been a little bit of a trip down memory lane, actually going back and thinking about some of these projects. But it's great to be able to share it with you all. So once again, So I guess a place to start, certainly for me, is just making a land acknowledgement. I just want to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional communities on whose lands we meet and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Part of how we normally introduce ourselves here is not only acknowledging the places where I live, and that's in Hamilton, New Zealand, on the lands of the Waikato people, but also just introducing the place where I'm from. So, ko maki o Taonga, ko wai o te awa, ko mātātua te waka, ko Whakatōhea te iwi. So those are my connections back to my people in the area of Whakatōhea. But I guess what I'm here to talk a little bit about is some of the some of the ethics activities and work we've been a part of. And one of those was putting together the Tika guidelines, which are guidelines for Māori research ethics, primarily it was primarily in the area of health research and how that's how it developed and how it's been taken up and become a part of our national ethical standards here in Aotearoa New Zealand. So the guidelines for Māori research ethics came about. There was a group of Māori members of ethics committees that were getting together essentially as a what do you call it? Sort of a collegial activity, a sort of a networking opportunity. And out of that group of Māori members of ethics committees, they formed a pūtai or a writing group, and that was the group that then did the work to try and put together some guidelines for Māori research ethics. A lot of those conversations that were being held at that time were about how the ethical principles that were in place were, and the process itself of ethical review was meeting the needs of Māori, was consistent with Māori values. And so these were the kinds of discussions that were going on at that point in time. And this has been over a sort of probably a period of 10 years in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so part of trying to put together a Māori framework was to help explain key ethical concepts for Māori, from a Māori point of view, to support decision-making around Māori ethical issues, to identify ways to address Māori ethical concerns, and to clarify the Kaitiaki roles, or the sort of stewardship governance roles of Māori ethical committee members. And so part of the background to the guidelines was these sort of, I guess, components emerged from the discussion. One was emphasizing the importance of relationships and outcomes, not just the, I guess, the evaluation of the principles. We're also conscious that it wasn't a sort of an exercise in an either or, and that a lot of the Western ethical principles that were a part of the process were ones that we supported as well. And we were trying to sort of blend those ideas, both with ideas, sort of Indigenous perspectives, the Treaty of Waitangi, which is sort of one of our treaties, and the sort of ideas that come out of that, as well as tikanga Māori or Māori values. And that we're conscious that research happens in a whole range of different contexts. And so the ethical review of that project also needs to take that into account. And so thinking about the difference between say a sort of a general population study, a study that's targeted towards the Māori community, and then a community participatory community-based study, you'd all have different expectations about what that might look like. And so we created this progressive framework to try and think about it in that kind of way. And then it was important to link to the operational standard, and that was just the guide that was the document that guided how ethics committees work. So one of the things that was important to us at that time is that we weren't creating something where you had to choose the operational standard to operate by, or some sort of Māori guideline, that they needed to be integrated so you could see how things operated together. And so we started with one of our starting points was thinking about this sort of, I guess, a thought exercise of if our country hadn't been taken over and we hadn't been subject to colonization, how would we deal with researchers that came to our community, and what sorts of questions would we ask them? And so the kind of first question was, well, what's the genesis of this project? How's it come about? And in this instance, we have a sort of the Māori question for that, and also this idea around whakapapa, which is kind of like the beginnings. The next questions was kia wai te mana mō tēnei kaupapa. So it's like who's in control, who's in charge in relation to this project. And so mana became another one of those kind of key areas. Me pehea tika tēnei kaupapa. So how do we ensure that the things you're saying about how the outcomes will merge, how does that come about? And then Mawai and Manaki tēnei kaupapa. So who keeps the project safe? Who keeps the people safe? As this is carrying on. And so these kind of areas around whakapapa, mana, tika, and manaki became the key areas we use for shaping the framework itself. And you see here we then aligned, even though it wasn't necessarily a direct alignment, sort of these ideas, the Māori word with these ideas. So mana became about justice and equity, and those were areas that were already being discussed in the context of the operational standard. Tika, we related to the research design, manakitanga to the cultural and social responsibility, and then the only thing that was a little bit new was really whakapapa and relationships. So it wasn't necessarily an ethical principle, but there were expectations around consultation and engagement that were talked about in terms of the process. If you're sort of looking at this and wondering where is informed consent, that's set within the framework. And I think what we realized, and also came out of some previous work, is that a lot of the kind of the general impetus, the sort of like the kind of the general framing of Māori values tends to prioritize kind of beneficence over autonomy. And so that kind of collective benefit that might emerge, those ideas around collectivity are best represented by the sort of the principles that sit around the outside. The more individually mediated things like consent are still there, they just sit within the framework and they apply in particular places. And so the Te Ara Tika framework was put in place. There's trying to remember the date. I think it was like about 2010, and it was one of the things that was done was it was attached to a document which people had to read as part of the ethics review process. So it became an appendix to that document. It was really good because it enabled the guidelines to be read and utilized right from the time it was created. And after about sort of 10 years of being in the system, there was a review of the operational standards and the creation of national ethical standards for health and disability research. And as a part of that process, there was a decision made to include the Te Ara Tika principles alongside the kind of classic bioethic principles. And so this partnership of principles became what represents how we now talk about New Zealand principles in relation to health and disability research. So that was in some ways a little bit of the beginnings of that kind of work. And one of the things that also sat in the back of those guidelines when they were created was a reference to some of the areas where there was more sensitivity for communities around types of research, in particular genetics research and use of human samples and biobanking. And so that became the subject of a follow-up study, which looked at sort of Māori views around genomic research and biobanking. And so that's what led to the creation of the Te Mata Ere guidelines for genomic research. And we'll see here a whakatōhea. So whakatōhea is like a sort of a proverb. A lot of times they're traditional proverbs. This was one which was actually created alongside some community members. So mea ta haere mā ngā ngaru kei whakatōtu te aroha o Tangaroa. And so that's really just saying you need to be careful when you're on the waves. And it's like, so whether you're riding the wave, you know, potentially fall off it, or on the beach and the waves coming at you, that's how we often feel about some of these kind of new technologies, is that there's this sort of things are coming at us which we have not too much control over. And you can navigate them, but you just have to be careful in the way that you do that. So I guess, you know, putting together these kinds of guidelines need to be a really collaborative process, both with communities in Aotearoa, but ones overseas as well. And so we engage with a number of our Indigenous colleagues. It was important in this context. Also because research is becoming an international exercise. There's lots of networking that's happening, and also the systems within which we operate, whether they're sort of data management systems, publications, all operating in a global context. That information that's developed in one place is used in others. There's lots of research projects that are internationally based and have, like, you know, multiple sites across multiple different countries. And so there's a sort of a general alignment of ethical principles that happens, you know, across these places. And so it's important to be able to share sorts of ideas that can be kind of transnational in origin as well. So this project led to the creation of at least two of these guidelines. The ones on the left, He Tangata Keitua, which are guidelines for biobanking with Māori, and Te Mata Ere, the guidelines for genomic research. When we were doing the project, we realized that the context and there's quite a different context between doing sort of genomic research and then that data being stored, or those samples being stored for future use. And I think it's kind of really, really important thinking about some of the limitations of consent in that context, because a informed consent for unspecified future use doesn't make sense in a whole lot of ways. Neither the person nor the researchers know what the future use is, so therefore you really can't be informed in lots of ways. And so needing to have this kind of different way of thinking about how people agree to be part of a project, and then what that looks like in terms of separate ideas around biobanking or use of that material into the future. And then the one on the right is a sort of a follow-up project which we've done, just thinking about genomic research for Indigenous flora and fauna, which all end up running together in different ways. But the Tangata Ira project was really, or Tangata Ira itself kind of talks about the different faces of the gene, or the different sorts of understandings of genetics which exist within a community. And that's what we really needed to reflect as we were sort of talking to these communities, because they understood, people understand about genetics. They don't necessarily understand it from a scientific point of view, but they get the concepts that relate to it, because they see it in their families and their communities, around things like plant breeding, animal breeding. There's different ways which they can engage with ideas around genetics. And so one of the activities that we did was to essentially develop a cultural logic and think about what were the Māori concepts which people use to help orientate themselves to this subject. And so the starting point for anything around genetics, at least in a Māori context, is whakapapa. And this is a word that relates to not just the kind of genealogy. So genealogy is sort of the typical translation. So it has these sort of, elements of genetics, but also there's these social components around the understanding about relationships. And one of the things we say is whakapapa is a taonga. And so whakapapa is something precious. Both that sort of understanding of those relationships, but you could also drop that down into the DNA itself. The samples are taonga, and they're precious as well. Anything that's precious, a taonga has a tapu associated with it, and the tapu sort of means that it just needs to be managed or restricted in some ways. It's how it needs to be looked after. And in that instance, when you're providing samples, providing DNA to a research project, and think about a gift, DNA on loan, all these different sorts of things. But through our discussions, we realized that what is actually being gifted when people are engaging in a project and handing over their samples, their data, their material into the project, is they're actually gifting you the responsibility to look after it. So something which they would normally be looking after is now your responsibility. And so the tāhoha becomes this gift of that, the gifting of that responsibility, as much as it is the gifting of the material itself. But in doing that, it was important to outline what does that responsibility look like? How you, now that you're taking responsibility for those decisions, how should you be making them? And so we identified a few different principles which you should follow, and some kind of protocols that support that action. And so one of the principles was Māori, and this was really thinking about the level of integrity of within which the system works. Wairua was about the level of comfort that people have in relation to their samples being in a research context. And that was both at sort of an individual level and a community level, and mana related to the level of control. And so that translated into, consent at one level, but also governance at another level. Kind of that same thing about thinking about the individual, but also the community. And so this sort of I guess in some ways, these kind of key cultural ideas and this cultural logic is something which we could then talk about both with community members who understood the cultural concepts, but we're trying to work out how they related to the genetics context, and researchers and health professionals that understood the sort of the genetics context, genomics context, but wanted to understand how the cultural concepts connected to those as well. And we can use exactly the same discussion. And then that translated then into just thinking about what sorts of conversations make sense at what time. And so you see the Te Ara Tika at the top. We still thought that was important because, whether it's genetic research, genomic research, or any sort of other research, those same ideas remain. But there's different sorts of conversations you might have as you're doing the consultation for a project, thinking about purpose, governance, benefit, cover what sort of principles to follow, and then the things that would play out within the research project itself around its methods and consent and communication and the protocols that would be followed, and then the things that happen afterwards as well, because often in a discussion about research, you're talking about the sort of the purpose, the things that happen after the research finished. That's where a lot of the benefits are going to arise. But and often it's not your direct responsibility. It's going to shift to someone else. And so for each of these areas, we like this one here, we developed a set of questions, and those questions were then a part of the guidelines as well. And really just a way to support conversations that were happening between researchers and communities around the project, and have people start thinking in advance around some of these issues here, like who's making decisions about the use of samples and data, what rights and interests and intellectual property could be recognized, some of these types of conversations. So this was sort of highlighting here one of my colleagues, Barry Smith, who passed away, and he would always talk about equipoise, and I thought it was something to do with horses, but anyways, he said it was all around equity, and it was about the relative distribution of risks and benefits. And I think that was important because in a sort of an ethics committee, we're often looking to balance risks and benefits, but often the benefits are occurring in one place and the risks are occurring to another, to one community, and the risks are occurring to another. And so, being able to think about the relative risks and benefits, and that it's not only risks but also benefits that then accrue to some of their sort of marginalized communities, Indigenous communities, is really important around thinking about equitable research. And so here there's also another whakatōhea, a proverb, kei tō te awa māpara he tangata ki he mā. And this is an old one that was actually an old proverb that was it was a prophecy foreseeing the coming of the Pākehā, or the white people to New Zealand, and said that their said awe māpara is the soot which they used to use in the tattoos and the tāmoko that people had on their faces. And they're saying beyond the tattooed face, there's another person, and it says he mā. And mās means either white or it means clean. So, an untattooed face. So in this kind of context, it's like, who's responsible for making the decisions after consent's been given? That's the point where, things shift away from the individual, from the participant, and that responsibility gets delegated to the people that then hold it. And often it's not, that isn't, really clearly spelled out. And in some ways it becomes a little bit of a delegation of authority over to the PI, over to the biobank, over to, some of these groups. And I think, having more clarity about that's actually where that responsibility has been shifted, is probably, a good thing. So I guess, the whole point of putting together guidelines is to help inform better research practices. The diagram on the right there is an example of a cancer research group that then took the Tika guidelines and tried to put it in practice within their, or put it into practice within their research team. And so there they used a sort of a traffic light system to show what sorts of activities they were either established, were under development, or still needed to be done, around a whole range of areas. And you can see there things like, relationship building with health providers and tissue banks, thinking about informed consent processes for both individuals and whānau and their families, data governance, collection and storage of tissue, analysis and extraction, and then thinking about, components around dissemination and capacity building too. And just highlighting with the diagram on the left that these similar sorts of conversations were happening in other countries. And this was the framework that was put together by the colleagues in the US that were thinking about, ethical genomic research with Indigenous communities in that context as well. And so just as I talked about the need to do not only just genomic research guidelines, but biobanking guidelines, this is then how we thought about kind of the biobanking context. And we did the same thing, at least in terms of identifying different areas around which there was a sets of questions made, but really thinking about the I guess the areas of responsibility. So if we're thinking about the data, the tissue, and the DNA as being sort of important components, or Taonga, then at an operational level, what sorts of responsibilities have people got around, ensuring consent is done properly, communicating with participants, enabling access, and thinking about what sort of protocols sit in place. And then around those operational stuff, there's the governance component, and what are their responsibilities in terms of thinking about the policies that they put in place, maintaining the purpose of the biobank, ensuring that there's benefit that comes from it, and their stewardship responsibilities. And then those things also sitting within the context of a sort of a broader system or community, and the need for that to support education and understanding and translation, and have a degree of accountability out to not only the Māori communities, but also the research and clinical communities as well. So there's, really thinking about how not only the creation of the guidelines then became a part of the standards, and so it starts to become more embedded in the way in which things operate. But at that point, there's things that need to be done around strengthening those systems and building capacity. And so I just want to highlight the SING program, Summer Internship for Indigenous Genomics. This operates in Aotearoa. We've been running it since 2016, but it was certainly something which we took from our colleagues in the US, who've been running it prior to that, program which Deborah's been a part of as well, and is now extended to Canada and Australia. And you see how these, I just want to kind of highlight, this is another project which then sort of moved on from genomic research into gene editing, and thinking about how Māori values influence that. And you can just see on the left-hand side there, these same sorts of ideas that emerge around whakapapa, Maori, mana, Taonga, tapu, Kaitiaki. So these are all sort of central concepts to a Māori worldview, which then you see play out or be understood in different ways. And I think even though there's been a general reticence to get involved in gene editing projects, and the feeling that it's sort of playing God and messing around with nature, was clear from our conversations that actually it's all about the context of the use rather than the technology itself. And there's some uses that will be supported and some uses that won't be. and they can either enhance the values or diminish the values depending on that context and depending on the level of control. And then that sort of, these projects kind of spurred these other ideas around not just the samples, but also the data itself and how they get used, and how you get the shift of what's personal, what people feel is personal information. If you ask them, do you think your health information is personal? They say yes. Do you think your DNA is personal? They say yes. But all of this information is being shifted through research projects from that space into public spaces, open data spaces. And then in those areas, it can, even though it's public or open, it's in a format which can only be used by certain groups that have the right sort of capacity or skills or resources, which means effectively they become privatized in a way, and used in a way that helps to generate kind of new products and services. And so this kind of shifting from what was personal information to something that becomes more corporate could see this flow, and people, I think, have a sense of that. And so we know that data is a valuable resource. People felt like they have rights in relation to their tissue and their raw data, and they have interests in relation to their research, in relation to the research and any sort of applications and derivatives that get generated from that. And so that, means that we need to start thinking about, better ways of benefit sharing. And also became the kind of the start for me to get involved also in discussions around Indigenous data sovereignty. So I'll try and do a little bit of a cover of this, and then leave some space for questions as well. But just really, this whole idea around Indigenous data sovereignty was this discourse around rights and interests. And it was a conversation, at least the one around rights and interests, that was happening in the general public as we were thinking about that kind of shift into open data, open science, information being made available, what were the rights of individuals in terms of consenting for that to happen or not, or could it just be done? And so, we were going, okay, where is the Indigenous perspective in this debate? And it was something that became informed by things like treaty rights and Indigenous rights, cultural intellectual property rights, but also Indigenous research ethics. And you could see some of the things I've been talking about in the first part of this talk. And these two themes in particular emerged, one around data for governance. So if you need to make good decisions, if you've got good data, then that should help you with your decision making. And often communities were finding it difficult to access information and data from, the places where it was. So how do you get, greater access to that data? And then if that data is being made available, more generally available, what role should they have in the governance of that data? And so managing access to ensure that it's only being used in ways that are, relevant and responsive to those communities. So data sovereignty as a concept was a cloud computing one. And it stated that data is subject to the laws of the nation within which it's stored. And what we were proposing is that data should be subject to the laws of the nation from which it comes. So if it's coming from your community, then your community should be able to say, this is how that data should be used. And so that for researchers, in this kind of context, data sovereignty implies that data should be subject to the protocols of the organization within which it's stored. So I'm pretty sure John Hopkins would agree with that. So yeah, you guys have to follow our rules. But Indigenous data sovereignty expects that the data is subject to the protocols of the nation from which it's collected. So if you're collecting information from a tribal nation, then they should have a say around how you look after it as well. And so those protocols become a mix of what's right for you, but also what's right for them. And this also kind of aligns with, sort of different principles that have emerged in places. This is the First Nations Indigenous Governance Centre in Canada, and they've had the OCAP principles, very strong, probably the strongest expression of what might be Indigenous data sovereignty around thinking about ownership, control, access, and possession. The Māori data sovereignty principles. After this session, you're almost becoming an expert in Māori words. So you once again repeated a lot of sort of similar ideas that emerged before, but this was then taking these sort of values and thinking about how do they make sense in the context of data. So thinking about, these issues around authority and relationships, obligations, collective benefit, reciprocity, and guardianship around how data is used. And so those were kind of, I guess, local in the sense of, country specific sort of principles that were emerging. And then through the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and the activities we were seeing as we engaged with the Research Data Alliance and some of these global conversations, looking at things like the FAIR principles and the different sorts of principles that were used to promote open data and open science. We contrasted those with what we were seeing in the sort of Indigenous spaces and saw that things like the FAIR principles, really related to the characteristics of the data itself. And the Indigenous principles tended to be more about the people and the purpose. And so we ended up with the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance around collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility, and ethics. And so this has now been essentially adopted as one of the kind of key global sets of principles alongside the FAIR principles, at least in relation to open data and open science. And have recently, through the Global Indigenous Data Alliance as well, also started trying to articulate what Indigenous people's rights and data look like. And so when people have talked about Indigenous rights in the past, often talk about a bundle of rights and interests. And there's sort of an assertion that these rights exist without being as specific about what sorts of things they might relate to. And so this is kind of the first piece of work which has been coming out saying, okay, look, there's these sorts of rights. Now, it's not saying that all of these rights apply all the time to every context, but in any context, at least one of the rights might be relevant. Ones that relate to, getting access to data in different ways, or could be important in the context of governing data as well. So we've been thinking, a lot, and hopefully we've sort of seen that through the sort of activity so far around how traditional knowledge, traditional processes, traditional values can inform the way we think about how to deal with sort of the challenges in front of us. And so this was a project that was starting to think about traditional knowledge and how that was shared, and knowing that not all traditional knowledge was openly available, but there was a way in which the holders of that knowledge decided how that they would share it with others. And the words on the left, the words in the diagram on the left-hand side reflect the key concepts that emerge from those discussions. And what we realized as we sort of looked at those ideas is that some of them, or at least two of them, related to the data itself and the nature of the data. Some of them related to the use of the data and how it was being used, and some of it related to the users and an assessment of the users. And so these became things that we thought maybe we could apply these to thinking about data access as well. And so we use that these ideas to try and think about sort of different characteristics, the concept, related it to a characteristic, and then had an assessment question. And so this first two ideas around sensitivity and accessibility related to the data itself. And just kind of realizing that there's always a little bit of a balance in how these things will apply, a little bit like the sort of ethics principles. You know, data might be sensitive, but if it's already, you know, widely accessible, you know, that's sort of, you know, what might you do about it, or what can you do about it? Ideas around value, trust, originality, and the nature of the application related to the data use. And then ideas around the relationship, the expertise, the authority, and the responsibility related to the data users. And so the sort of general idea here was that depending on the sort of the balance of how these questions were answered, is you get a sense of, you know, does it make sense for that data to sit in an open space? Should it be subject to what I call passive governance, or just kind of like general protocols, or does it need a sort of more active form of governance, which would require, you know, a decision from someone to get access to it? And that sort of framework then became the basis for what's called Ngā Tikanga Paehere. And this is the framework that's been put in place by Statistics New Zealand to enable access to the integrated data infrastructure, which is a kind of large, I guess, the large integrated data set that brings together data from a whole range of different government agencies so that researchers can use it. So it sits behind it, you know, you've got to have it's by, you know, you've got to apply for access to the data, but in doing that, they make use of this framework to do it. Originally, they used the 5 SAFEs framework: safe people, safe projects, safe settings, safe data, and safe output. And we were able to align the 5 SAFEs framework with those sort of 10 Māori concepts and create this as Ngā Tikanga Paehere. And so there's a set of questions that relate to each of these areas. There's a scoring which comes about. If your score isn't high enough, you don't get access to the data. It's an iterative process, so the team will work with you to improve your kind of, you know, the things that you're doing, so that you have the right sort of expertise and skills and relationships with the community, that you can maintain public confidence and trust in the use of the data, that you use good data standards and practices, have a clear purpose and action, and can balance the risks and benefits in a way that's you know, consistent with Māori values as well. So I'm gonna wrap up there, I think. Oh, actually, no. This is so just to say that you know, these ideas have also been then started. People are thinking about them in the context of ethical health, or the use of ethical AI within a health context, and you know, thinking about, does this guide them as they're thinking about that coming about. So I'm finishing up because I'm actually at the end of my slide. So just want to say thanks very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Maui. It was great to hear sort of the whole story, which I hadn't heard before, of the development of these various guidelines. So thank you so much. So I'm going to invite folks to add questions to the Q&A. And maybe while we're waiting for that, I'll start with a question. So I've asked this question of a few different people, and I'd love to hear how you think about it. So you did for us quite a bit of translation between Maori principles and sort of traditional Western ethics principles and the kinds of frameworks that are in place in the US and Europe and elsewhere. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think about the relationship between the fair and the care principles, and like how they sit in relation to each other, and whether or not you think they can coexist.
Oh yeah, look, I definitely think they can coexist, and it was, right from the beginning when we put the care principles together, we had the acronym Be Fair and Care, because we recognise that they would be complementary. Even for Indigenous communities, the fair principles are important. You can't be involved with governing any kind of data if you can't find it. So there's a sort of an inherent relationality between them. There's also an inherent tension, but I think it's a tension that people are already aware of, in the sense that there's not all data is open, and we can have a sort of a principle around wanting to move towards open data, but there's all sorts of privacy reasons we don't disclose personal information. There's a whole range of commercial exceptions that are made for not disclosing information. Often there's other reasons which information is withheld. Often it's for kind of giving people space to publish things before it's made open. So these things are in these kind of exceptions, if you will, and they're probably not really exceptions. It's sort of like it's been worked out as normal practice around how that can happen. They sit there as well. Now, being able to maybe withhold things for cultural reasons, should just sit there, and there is kind of one of those factors as well. So, when people talk about, I think they've kind of moving to this position that they want data to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary, as the way of kind of sort of balancing where that sits. So I think one of the challenges I see with actually sort of operationalizing the care principles, and there's sort of 10 years behind the FAIR principles in that regard, is that the FAIR principles, because they speak to the data, it's got a more defined space in which you can I guess action it and implement them. Because the care principles are talking so much about the people and the purpose, it sort of extends across the whole sort of data life cycle in a quite different way. The consultation before, the things that might happen after. And so in that sort of instance, it's I guess it's going to be sort of addressed in a range of ways. And so one of the projects happening at the moment, alongside the Stephanie Carroll, the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Alliance, and the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, is thinking about what does implementation of the care principles look like, and trying to say, okay, this is what it might look like for the researchers, this is what it might look like for the institution, this is what it looked like for a repository, this is what funders can do. So thinking about the different contributions different parties can make towards the implementation of care.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I tried to put this in the chat, but I can only communicate with the host and the panelists. So FAIR stands for folks who aren't familiar with the FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So they're the sort of standard science principles around, or science-oriented principles around, data sharing and use. All right, so we have a question from Melissa McCradden. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I wondered if your work, or if you're familiar with work where the environmental impact of AI training and use is considered within these frameworks. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I want to say yes, no, maybe. Only from the point of view of that, I think there's the potential for them to inform sort of thinking around those areas, and the sort of shift, I think, from certainly at least from thinking about data sovereignty, which has been more about the data and where it's been, and sort of kind of issues around enhancing Indigenous control of Indigenous data. When you think about the application and use of that data, and particularly starting to think about what that happens and, you know, how that happens through machine learning and artificial intelligence. This is a sort of a space which people are really wanting to start thinking about now. So even the sort of health application stuff is very new, but there is certainly a lot of interest around and a lot of publications coming out recently around the application of the care principles into environmental data spaces. So biodiversity research, kind of arenas like that, not quite into the AI component of it, but, you know, sort of heading down that track.
Yeah, so while we're waiting for more questions, I'll ask a bit of a follow-up, which I've been thinking a bit about lately. So those of us who work on, you know, human subjects research and, you know, genomic data sharing, use, et cetera, you know, anything human data is those conversations are very, very separate from anything non-human data, right? Whereas I think in the Indigenous data use spaces, there's much more of a continuum there, and a conversation between sort of the policy conversations around non-human data and the policy conversations around human data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Look, there's definitely an artificial policy distinction that's made between those things, which I think like communities don't, kind of in a sort of a general sense, don't get, or, you know, doesn't make sense to them in that way. I mean, there's I think the whole thing around the sort of human genetic data was around, okay, there's kind of a benefit to people. You don't have to think about benefit sharing in the same way. It was excluded from, you know, the Nagoya Protocol. But we know that, you know, increasingly human genetic information is used a lot by pharmaceutical companies in the generation of kind of products, and, you know, there's a whole sort of industry, you know, huge industry that sits around that. And to say that, you know, benefit sharing shouldn't operate in that space is, you know, doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think, you know, but a lot of people have been questioning that, and I think you're starting to see some changes there. I think particularly with the conversations around the Convention on Biological Diversity around digital sequence information, and that becoming subject to benefit sharing, it's going to be harder to argue that there's a sort of a distinction there in the same sort of way as the genetic resource itself. So I think you know, these things are starting to be questioned at the moment. You know, how much it unwinds will probably depend a little bit on the sorts of decisions that different institutions make around how they want to operate as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have another question from Adnan Harad. Apologies if I've mispronounced your last name. What effect have these guidelines have on equitable recruitment and participation, and how involved is the community in the continued evolution of these guidelines?
Great questions. I couldn't tell you. I would hope that it's had an effect. I think what it has done is I think it's informed researchers around the different ways in which they should behave in relation to working, you know, and working with communities, and I'd hope that has supported process of recruitment and participation. I think, you know, pretty much there's still, you know, getting equitable recruitment often is related as much to the relationships you build as it is the sort of, you know, the kind of knowledge and understanding you have. Just because you read the guidelines doesn't directly, you know, equate to then getting, you know, better recruitment. It's all going to be around the processes and things that you put into place. So I think that, you know, it helps, but it's not going to just deal with itself. the community were quite involved in the development of the guidelines. I'm not quite sure at what stage the guidelines themselves may be updated, thinking about the evolution of the guidelines. But I think what you are seeing is more community input into different sorts of processes and practices and new projects that are emerging. So the guidelines themselves might not be evolving, but the sorts of information that sits around it and kind of local research protocols and stuff, those things are starting to evolve, and often with input from specific communities that are working in alongside researchers. So I think, I'd say, in some ways the guidelines aren't supposed to be a rule book as this is how you must do it, but kind of show people or give them an idea about what sort of good looks like, but allow them to, work with local groups to see what's appropriate. And we wrote the guidelines in ways that would be sort of accessible both to the communities and the researchers, because it's not only just the researchers that might be unaware of things that they could be talking about, but often the communities themselves don't know what sorts of topics should be a part of the discussion either.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Ella Mitchell, who's one of our human genetics students here. Hi, Ella. I love the talk. I love the concept of working to center the values of different Indigenous nations in data sharing. Do you have ideas of how this can be incorporated for minoritized cultural groups that may not have an official governing board, for example, Nigerian Americans in the United States?
Yeah, kia ora, Ella. There's always some tricky questions to be had. Yeah, look, that's certainly something that we're sort of thinking about a lot in the context of some other work I do with local context and applying, traditional knowledge and biocultural labels to data sets. It's certainly easier. I think that there's two bits. There's when you have a group that is, I guess, kind of incorporated or has some sort of official governing body, it becomes easier to talk about, I guess, getting some kind of authority in support of what you're doing. Now, that's not necessarily the only way that can come about, and when we did our put together our genetics guidelines, we talked to families that had that were dealing with genetic conditions, within their families. We talked to some tribal communities, not necessarily all of them, and they were just ones that had either engaged with genetic research or hadn't, or were the tribes that were in the areas where you had the medical schools. So they had sort of different sort of kind of responsibilities or relationships with the area. And so I think, engaging with whether they're non-status communities or not kind of formal governing communities is fine, because it's just about getting kind of input on what people think about it. And some of the ideas that certainly came up out of our project, which is also in a New Zealand context, when I talk about them internationally, people kind of get the ideas. They don't obviously share the same language, but sort of the concepts make sense to them. And I think being able to surface, key concepts that are of concern to this family, this community, they'll often translate across a whole range of different contexts.
Great. We have a couple more questions, but we are at the top of the hour, 1 o'clock here, 7 o'clock where you are. So I'll just take the opportunity again to thank you so much for getting up early to talk with us and for sharing this story and your research with us. You would be hearing lots of clapping if we were in person.
Thanks. Cheers, Deborah. Thanks, everyone.
Have a wonderful day.
Kia ora.